Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Okay. We know this is the deep dive, not a standard video platform, but we are absolutely jumping straight into the source material today.
We really are.
Because our mission is, well, it's simple, but it's also pretty profound. We're pulling back that velvet curtain on history. We want to see what was actually happening, who was really pulling the strings, and where the brutal, complex reality just completely shatters the myths we've been told.
Indeed. And we have a phenomenal stack of sources for this one. We're blending, high academic history with pure archaeological reports and even some ancient folklore.
And what's the connection between all of them?
It's the application of knowledge. Whether that's the desperate knowledge of how to move quietly in the shadows, or the mastery of knowing how to use divine prophecy to secure a throne.
Or just harnessing the sheer physics of gravity to break a 40-foot castle wall.
Exactly.
We are tackling 3 massive but connected stories today, all exploring this idea of power through, well, invisibility and engineered control. We're going to start in the medieval shadows, looking at the grim, short-lived reality of the, let's say, amateur assassin.
Then we pivot.
A huge pivot to the absolute light of power, analyzing the myth-making, the ruthless ambition of Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great.
And from there,
Then we transition to the architectural secrets of the ancient world. We're talking the puzzling palace of Knossos, and then the brutal science of siege warfare.
so our focus for you, the learner, is really some serious myth busting. We're going to look at what happens when desperation meets a total lack of rules in the shadows.
And when political ambition absolutely requires divine intervention and blood.
And when architecture becomes both a confounding puzzle and a defense mechanism against overwhelming force. So prepare for some surprising facts and some deep context that will, I think, really redefine these historical figures and events for you.
Okay, let's unpack this first section. And like we promised, this is the ultimate cinematic buzzkill.
Chuckles. It really is.
If you grew up with fantasy novels or movies, your image of a medieval assassin is probably this mysterious loner, sleek black robes, retractable wrist blades, maybe trained in a hidden brotherhood.
Right.
Our sources make it so abundantly clear that this entire fantasy it's pure fiction. The truth of being a medieval assassin just fundamentally sucked.
It did. The primary myth we need to just annihilate immediately is that this was any kind of organized profession.
Not a career path.
Not at all. According to the sources, being an assassin was the last stop on the life went horribly wrong train.
That's a great quote.
It's a perfect quote. You didn't choose this life. Society forced you into it.
You were utterly spat out into it. By circumstance, by total desperation. So who were these people?
Well, they were desperate peasants who'd lost their land in a famine, or disgraced soldiers who couldn't re-enlist. Ex-thieves who just failed too many times.
And crucially, they were people so far off society's radar that, and this is another quote, they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census.
That says it all, doesn't it? If you were well off, you paid someone to do it. If you were poor and desperate, you were the one getting paid.
And that desperation, it defines the targets they were asked to hit. You weren't risking your life to kill, Bob, the quiet turnip farmer.
No. The targets were always high value and high risk. A notoriously corrupt baron, a bishop who had gotten way too rich, or a local lord with high security.
And when you say high security, you mean?
12 bodyguards and a moat. The pay was tempting because the jobs were catastrophically risky. That risk-reward ratio was just horrifyingly skewed against the assassin.
Which brings us to the core issue, right? The training.
Or the complete lack of it.
Exactly. This wasn't some secret monastery. There were no wise silent mentors, no manuals, no pep talks. If you learned anything, it was, and I'm quoting here, by not dying the first few times you tried.
It was pure, brutal, on-the-job survival.
So the medieval assassin was, by our standards, a desperate amateur.
Completely. Operating in a hyper-aware, paranoid world. If you were lucky, maybe you had some disgraced military background, so you knew how to hold a knife, maybe navigate at night.
And if not?
If not, you're relying purely on instinct, improvisational luck, and, hoping the target security was having an off night. You had no blueprints, no safety briefings.
No lessons on where the noble's bedroom exits were?
You were literally figuring it out while hanging from a windowsill,
Yeah.
just hoping the rain muffled your footsteps.
That improvised, panicked approach becomes terrifyingly clear when we look at the methods. Specifically poison. The section on poison control sounds less like chemistry and more like sheer terror.
It was trial and error with heavy emphasis on error.
Wow.
It was herbal guesswork. Forget purified cyanide or fast-acting nerve agents. They were dealing with common but often unreliable plants, specific fungi, maybe some poorly refined mineral compounds.
And there was no scientific measurement, right? Dosing was just a guess.
Entirely guess, based on folklore.
So what happens when you get it wrong? Can you walk us through the disastrous consequences of that?
Well, the sources give us a range of outcomes, and none of them are good for the assassin. A pinch too little of whatever toxic herb you used, and the noble might only get mildly dizzy and more suspicious of his soup.
So you don't get the kill, you just get maximum suspicion.
Exactly. Now, the noble instantly increases security and starts rooting out traitors. A pinch too much, and the reaction might be so violent, say, instant projectile vomiting, that it alerts everyone in the room.
And that points directly to the food.
And worse, depending on the substance, the assassin might die from exposure themselves, just from handling the raw, toxic material. There was no medieval hotline for dosing advice.
And even if you nailed the dose, you still had to deal with the intense paranoia of a high-value target. I mean, noble meals were basically military operations.
They were. They went through multiple, often very nervous tasters, sometimes a guard dog even, before the meal ever reached the target's plate. You were trying to kill someone who was actively, constantly defended against the very threat you represented.
And if you did get caught, and the data suggests most were caught,
The vast majority, yes. Either during the attempt or shortly after.
you weren't looking at a quick execution.
Oh no, you were looking at interrogation that used tools with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight or the Pear of Anguish. It just puts the sheer, desperate, horrifying amateur nature of this whole thing into sharp, painful focus.
Okay, let's talk year, because this is where the fantasy really just collapses. We have to forget the fantasy gadgets.
Absolutely. The toolkit was anything that could be stolen, sharpened, or concealed beneath a tattered cloak without making a noise.
A clank.
Right. If you were truly lucky, you had a decent dagger. Not ornate, but functional and, hopefully rust-free.
Yeah.
The last thing you needed was an infection slowing you down. Maybe a garrote if you specialized in quiet, close-quarters work.
And the methods of concealment, these are fantastic historical details. Weapons hidden in hems, boots were my personal favorite detail. Inside, hollowed out bread.
That hollowed-out bread tells you two things at once. One, the budget was zero. And two, the operative was relying entirely on looking like a starving peasant carrying his meager lunch.
No special satchels, no custom holsters,
Pure improvisation.
and the disguise was just as grim. You didn't wear sleek black silk. You looked like, and this is a quote, a sick goat herder with something to hide.
The goal was to blend in. But blending in often meant looking like everyone else who hadn't eaten properly in months and who smelled, vaguely of the ditch they slept in.
So rags, robes 2 sizes too big.
Which actually made movement harder, not easier, and face coverings were often counterproductive. They didn't make you mysterious, they made you look like a leper.
Which is great for avoiding conversation.
But terrible for sneaking past the main gate, where the guards were paid to notice strange things.
The operational hazards were just staggering. You're fighting the best architecture of the age. Fortified stone walls with gatehouses, massive iron doors, murder holes designed to drop stones or tar on your head.
And moats full of things that bite.
Right. And even if you scaled those walls, you were constantly at risk of getting flamed for peeking with boiling oil or, as we talked about, that incredibly nasty boiling sand.
And getting inside was just the beginning. The target is surrounded by dozens of armed guards, paranoid staff, possibly even armed guests.
And they're using active defensive strategies, decoy beds, rotating sleeping rooms randomly.
They're not eating without extreme testing. You're not just fighting physical security, you are fighting medieval gossip and paranoia, which, in a close-knit court, traveled at light speed.
So you had one chance. One precise, perfect, non-squeaky, non-bloody ghost vanish in the night moment.
Anything less than flawless execution meant a public, theatrical death.
Which brings us inevitably to the motivation for all this misery, the coin. The promise of wealth got you in the door.
But the reality was you got paid in lies.
The ultimate client betrayal.
It is. The client wants a one-time service with absolutely no paperwork and, crucially, ideally no witnesses, including you.
So they offer a tempting upfront deposit?
Maybe enough to feed your family for a month,
Right.
with the rest promised upon completion. But that when the job is done is absolutely code for if you survive long enough to collect, and if we still want you alive to connect us to the crime.
And more often than not, they didn't even try to pay. The client either fled or, worse,
Or worse, they tried to kill the assassin themselves. Because, as the source says, a knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. They already risked exposure hiring you. Killing you is the final, cheapest security measure.
Some of the contracts were outright fake traps, weren't they?
Yes. Political traps. A client hires a known killer to take out a decoy target who is actually surrounded by guards waiting for a sting operation.
So the client gets rid of a political enemy, the decoy, and a dangerous variable, the assassin, all at once.
All while maintaining plausible deniability. And, of course, you can't exactly sue for breach of contract in the local magistrate's court.
Yeah.
Your isolation was absolute.
No guilds, no brotherhoods to protect you.
Any attempt to communicate with a client afterward was just incredibly dangerous. You were left with crippling trust issues.
And the superstition factor really seals this grim image. To the average peasant, you weren't just a killer. You were a cursed, unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your blade.
That fear, paradoxically, didn't make you safer. It just made your eventual capture more violent. Superstitious mobs don't need evidence or a trial. They just need a scapegoat.
If someone died unexpectedly in the village, the whisper starts.
Maybe it was a shadow man. And the result was spontaneous, horrific mob violence, shouting things like, "Burn him before he calls lightning."
So your only measure of success was vanishing.
That is the true endgame. If you managed the impossible, the perfect murder, you ran like hell, changed your name, and started the cycle over again. There was no endgame. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity.
Always watching your back, always moving.
The best you could hope for was to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believed in fairies and avoided you.
That's a truly powerful and grim picture. Power through total, desperate invisibility.
And now we move from that anonymous shadow to one of history's great architects of empire and myth, Olympias.
Mother of Alexander the Great.
She shows us that political power often relies less on physical steel and more on crafting an untouchable divine persona. If the assassin used invisibility to survive, Olympias used myth to rule.
This is a masterclass in political engineering. Let's unpack her journey, starting with her background. Before she was Olympias, she was
Myrtle.
Myrtle, a princess from Epirus, a region whose people claimed descent from the legendary Achilles. And she was not the princess who was interested in, courtly tapestries or diplomacy.
No.
She was steeped in ritual, omens, and the frenzied, ecstatic ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus. Her connection to the divine was intense and personal. The sources suggest she wasn't just a passive worshiper. She embodied the spiritual and the wild.
And the defining detail of her persona one that she actively encouraged, or at least exploited, was the serpent myth.
Right. Ancient sources, often written by rivals who were both terrified and enthralled, claim she kept sacred snakes in her chambers.
Sometimes even in bed.
This detail is everything. Whether it was literal fact or just political slander, the myth absolutely stuck, and that's what matters.
To her allies, it meant she was touched by the gods, divine, protective. To her enemies, it made her dangerously touched by something primal, something older and potentially more destructive than politics.
She was a living oracle, wrapped in the imagery of a goddess.
So when she married Philip II of Macedon around 357 BCE, it wasn't a standard royal wedding. It was a collision of prophecy and power.
And the union was immediately wrapped in celestial drama, which Olympias made sure was well advertised. Omens like lightning striking the sky.
And Olympias herself, dreaming of a thunderbolt entering her womb, giving birth to a lion.
This carefully curated myth established Alexander's divine destiny from his first breath. Philip might have been the brutal, brilliant general.
But Olympias made sure the world believed their son was not just a prince, but a scion touched by Zeus himself. And this was essential because the Macedonian court was not a stable place. It was a viper pit where kings were killed by cousins.
And Philip's polygamy didn't help.
No, their marriage was explosive, but Olympias refused to be sidelined. She maintained her own court, her own alliances, and crucially, her own cultic authority.
But then the cracks deepened when Philip took a serious rival, Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian-born noble.
This is not just another wife. This was an existential threat to Alexander's claim. The Macedonians prized pure Macedonian heritage, and Alexander's mother was from Epirus, a foreign state.
So if Cleopatra produced a son,
That boy would instantly be seen as having a pure Macedonian bloodline. This was the moment Olympias went from using myth as defense to using it as a weapon.
and the tension exploded publicly at the wedding feast. General Attalus, Cleopatra's uncle, drunkenly questioned Alexander's parentage.
Suggesting he wasn't fully Philip's son, but rather a hybrid product of Olympias's rumored divine serpent liaisons.
And Olympias didn't fight the rumor. She absorbed it, capitalized on it.
Exactly, she thought. Let them whisper that her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable by mere human politics. She and Alexander stormed out in a carefully staged display of outrage.
Her subsequent exile wasn't defeat.
It was a strategic move. She went to Epirus, gathered political and military support, and whispered venomous accusations into the ears of key figures, just waiting for the palace to rot from within.
This raises a critical question, though. If she had successfully built this divine, untouchable myth around Alexander, why did she later rely on such messy, undeniable political murders? Wouldn't that undermine the untouchable image?
That's a powerful point, and it speaks to her profound understanding of power. She understood that myth secures the long-term destiny.
But blood secures the immediate present.
Exactly. The divine myth made people fear Alexander's future. The murder of rivals made people fear Olympias right now. She created a necessary fear.
And the most pivotal moment was Philip's assassination. The killer was known, but the question of who orchestrated it
Echoed through history. Many believed, and modern historians still suspect, Olympias was behind it.
And her actions immediately afterward seemed to confirm her chilling ruthlessness.
She moved swiftly and brutally to eliminate Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter. The historical accounts are truly chilling. Some sources say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her infant child die.
Others describe the child being thrown onto a burning funeral pyre.
The rationale was absolute political calculus. She knew that in a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, even an infant, is a future civil war.
With Cleopatra's bloodline erased, nothing stood between her teenage son Alexander and the undisputed throne.
She wasn't just protecting his rise, she was engineering it through blood, terror, and myth.
So as Alexander left to conquer the world, Olympias transitions from open strikes to whispered influence.
She remained the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She constantly advised him, warning him of ambitious rivals like the regent Antipater, criticizing his adoption of Persian customs.
She saw that as diluting his divine Macedonian legitimacy.
Her letters to Alexander were political briefings laced with venom, always reminding him that his success was divine and owed to her. She used her religious authority to undermine Antipater's regency, showing the power of a calculated whisper across thousands of miles.
When Alexander died in 323 BCE, the empire crumbled into chaos.
And Olympias saw her final chance to protect his legacy. His young son, Alexander IV. She allied with the widow Roxana, recognizing the infant was the last true piece of the dynasty.
This led to her most audacious move, the conflict with Cassander, Antipater's son, who'd seized control of Macedon.
Olympias returned at the head of an army, not to plead, but to rule. Her vengeance was swift and total. She hunted down Cassander's loyalists, executed the puppet king. She reminded Macedon what absolute royal power looked like.
But Cassander besieged her in the fortress of Pydna. She endured for nearly a year,
maintaining the presence of a goddess even as her provisions ran out. And Cassander, he understood the myth she had built. He hesitated to kill her himself, knowing she carried belief like armor.
And the source material gives us this incredible final detail. When the executioners were finally ordered to kill her, the native Macedonian soldiers refused to strike the first blow.
They were terrified of striking the mother of a god.
That's the perfect manifestation of her life's work.
It is. Her power, even in utter defeat, was rooted in belief. Cassander had to use foreigners, non-Macedonian soldiers who had no memory of her power or her serpents to finally kill her.
She died in the dust, but she succeeded in ensuring that Alexander's story was forever sealed as a divine storm, a prophecy fulfilled.
She proved that cunning and myth-making were often far more effective than brute force.
That transition is profound. We moved from the desperate amateur assassin and the powerful queen engineering belief to engineering of an entirely different kind. Now we're looking at the civilization that engineered a puzzle and the armies that engineered destruction.
We're moving from the engineering of destiny to the engineering of architecture and pure physics. And we begin with the Minoan wonder. Knossos.
Knossos is a breathtaking, almost unbelievable example of architecture as a puzzle.
It was the pulsing heart of the sophisticated Minoan civilization, built around 1900 BCE. It was truly massive, 150,000 square feet, over 1,000 interconnecting rooms, multi-story apartments.
And possibly the first flushing toilets in history.
Which is incredible. To ancient visitors, the palace must have felt like a dizzying, complex maze, a form of organized chaos. And it's that very complexity and disorienting layout that inspired the enduring myth of the labyrinth.
It wasn't built in neat parallel lines.
No, it was built in layers, wings, and interlocking loops, deliberately designed to be difficult for outsiders to navigate. Courtyards led unexpectedly to residential wings. Stairs spiraled into shadows. It was a palace designed to overwhelm you.
The Minoans, who flourished between 2600 and 1400 BCE, they were a naval trading power.
Right. They ruled the Aegean primarily through commerce and advanced artistry, not constant warfare. Their culture was strikingly different from the later, more militaristic Greeks. Their art celebrated nature dolphins, lilies, flowing designs.
And their famous bull-leaping rituals and powerful bare-breasted snake goddesses.
What's critical is that we still don't fully have access to their direct thoughts. We have their linear A script, but it remains stubbornly undeciphered.
So we're interpreting their entire civilization through the lens of their architecture and symbols.
Exactly. We're literally inside their mind, but the language is locked.
And those symbols are key to understanding the palace. The double axe, or labrys, was a key religious symbol found carved everywhere.
And scholars have strongly suggested that the word labyrinth itself may derive from labrys, meaning the palace was not a trap for a monster, but the sacred house of the double axe.
That's a profound difference. The entire structure wasn't just a dwelling for a king, it was a ritual machine, a complex temple.
Protected by its baffling complexity.
And then suddenly, this grand, peaceful civilization and its awe-inspiring palace were abandoned around 1400 BCE. It remains one of history's great silent mysteries. What are the strongest theories for the collapse?
We have two major competing theories. One points to natural disaster. The massive Thera-volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE.
Which would have sent tsunamis and ash clouds across the region?
Absolutely. It would have destabilized the entire island of Crete, potentially wiping out their navy and disrupting vital trade routes.
And the second theory?
Gradual absorption by a rising military power. Archaeological evidence suggests the more martial Mycenaeans, the ancestors of the classical Greeks, did take over briefly, but the site shows little evidence of a massive cataclysmic battle.
So our sources suggest that Knossos didn't fall with a scream, it fell with a whisper.
Implying a slow internal collapse, economic breakdown, or a gradual takeover. It vanished not with violence, but with a quiet, final fading of influence.
A stunning contrast. A civilization that engineered space to promote awe is replaced by cultures that engineered physics purely for destruction. We transition now to the brute force of siege engineering.
This marks a distinct shift from architecture as defense and ritual to physics as absolute offense. And we begin with the most straightforward application, the battering ram, what we'll call the brute.
Early rams were just tree trunks.
Simple handheld trunks, yes. But engineers quickly evolved them into massive roofed wheeled structures. The roofing, the testudo or tortoise shell, was essential to protect the men inside from projectiles and boiling liquids.
The Romans perfected this with the Ares.
The Ares, Latin for ram. These were massive tree trunks, tipped with heavy metal shaped like a ram's head. And crucially, the Ares was suspended by ropes or chains.
Why was that suspension system so important?
It allowed the men to apply constant rhythmic force, and it absorbed the massive recoil. They could hit the target repeatedly without destroying the ram or exhausting the operators. The sound of its rhythmic, thunderous impact must have been profoundly demoralizing.
So if the ram was the brute force, the catapult was the tactician.
Invented by the Greeks, 4th century BCE, it was the first true artillery system. And the genius here was not simple leverage, but the use of torsion.
Torsion is the key concept. Instead of a spring like a bow, it used twisted bundles of sinew or hair.
Wound tight with levers, storing an enormous amount of potential energy. When the arm was released, that sudden, massive unwinding of the torsion bundles launched the projectile.
And these were precise instruments. The ballista was like a giant crossbow, launching bolts capable of impaling several men at once.
The stone throwers lobbed 60-pound stones over walls, shattering masonry from a safe distance. But we have to talk about the psychological warfare.
They weren't just for stone.
No. Generals quickly realized the power of terror. They launched diseased corpses, severed heads, even live animals into besieged cities to shatter morale and contaminate food and water. An early, horrifying form of psychological and biological warfare.
And then we get to the majestic. The trebuchet, the king of medieval siege warfare.
The weapon that showed the ultimate, elegant mastery of gravity and leverage. Unlike the catapult's complicated torsion bundles, the trebuchet relied on a simple, enormous counterweight system.
The physics are beautiful in their destructive simplicity.
The counterweight, a massive box filled with earth or stones weighing tens of thousands of pounds, was attached to the short end of a massive arm. The projectile on the long end. When you release it, gravity pulls down the counterweight.
which accelerates the long arm and flings the stone over the wall.
The power was astonishing. It could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. These were slow-motion hammers from the heavens. And because of their high arcing trajectory, they didn't just smash the outer walls, they landed inside, hitting courtyards and barracks. No space was safe.
The Werewolf at Stirling Castle is the perfect example. The sheer terror it commanded.
It was a trebuchet so massive and notorious that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. Its construction alone was an announcement that resistance was futile.
Let's shift now to the subtle, invisible methods, moving from things that fly to things that burrow. Underground warfare. Sapping. The slow, invisible killer.
Sapping involved digging tunnels, often in complete darkness and silence, beneath the foundations of a wall. You'd prop the foundation up with wooden supports.
And then set the supports on fire.
When the timbers burned away, the foundation collapsed, and a section of the wall above would come tumbling down. At the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, King John's forces famously used the fat of 40 pigs to fuel the blaze, collapsing an entire tower.
But defenders were wise to this. They would dig counter tunnels.
Aimed toward the sound of the attackers digging. If the tunnels intercepted, the result was countermining. A violent, claustrophobic knife fight hundreds of feet beneath the earth, fought by torchlight with knives and shovels.
No glory there, just terror and darkness.
Exactly. And if the attackers did breach the walls, defenders had their own brutal tricks. Boiling liquids were standard.
But the sources detail one particularly vicious measure: boiling sand.
It wasn't as dramatic as burning oil, but it was far more effective against armored targets. Sand holds its heat far longer than water. When poured, it would slip through the tiny gaps in plate armor around the neck, the wrists, the elbows, and stay there.
Causing instant third-degree burns by literally cooking the flesh beneath the armor.
It turned a warrior into a screaming, incapacitated wreck in seconds.
And finally, we cannot discuss architectural defense without mentioning the ultimate military secret: Greek fire.
The mysterious, napalm-like substance developed by the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century CE, this is their ultimate trump card. It was squirted through nozzles onto enemy ships.
And it stuck to surfaces and kept burning, even on water.
It could not be extinguished by conventional means. It terrified opponents and gave the Byzantines naval supremacy for centuries. The formula was so closely guarded, a state secret, that when the Byzantine Empire finally fell, the formula died with it.
The most successful piece of military science to be perfectly erased from history.
It really brings the three threads together, doesn't it? The siege engineers, like the assassin and Olympias, rely on either overwhelming visibility, the trebuchet, or total invisibility, Greek fire's formula, sapping to achieve their aims.
And the principles remain valid.
Absolutely. Modern military tactics, especially shock and awe, owe an enormous debt to the physics and psychology of ancient siege warfare. The siege towers rolling forward were the original shock and awe, designed to break the spirit before the masonry.
So we've covered an incredible range today. We moved from the desperate amateur assassin, paid in lies, living in fear,
to the royal architect of empire, Olympias, who wielded sacred snakes and prophecy to protect her son's divine claim.
and finally to the architectural puzzle of Knossos and the precise physics required to break a stone wall.
The sheer contrast is what stands out. The romanticized, sleek, trained killer fantasies just shattered by the reality of the starving, clumsy amateur with a rusty dagger.
Then you have Olympias, whose power was so absolute, she convinced an entire generation her son was a god, using myth as her most potent weapon, even relying on it in her final moments.
The core insight here for you, the learner, is that history is defined by those who master the subtle, unseen applications of knowledge. Power doesn't always wear a crown.
Sometimes it wears peasant rags and a stolen dagger.
Sometimes it is an old woman whispering a deadly, religiously charged rumor across thousands of miles. And sometimes it's just the perfect, calculated ratio of weight and leverage in a trebuchet.
That's the real philosophical thread connecting all of them. The ultimate goal was often invisibility or plausible deniability.
The assassin vanishes to survive and protect his clan. Olympias engineered her moves from behind the curtain of prophecy, ensuring her fingerprints were only visible to those who believed.
And the Minoans built a palace so labyrinthine that it literally disappeared into myth before it fully vanished.
In every case, success meant making their true actions elusive, untraceable, or untouchable. The formula for Greek fire died. The identity of the assassin vanishes. The meaning of Knosso's symbols remains locked away.
So, here is the final provocation for you to mull over as you go about your day. What is truly more powerful in history? The thing that is widely remembered. The king, the wall, the great battle.
Or the thing that successfully, deliberately erases itself from the record. The secret formula, the unnamed shadow, the invisible force.
We have abundant records of the kings and the walls, but the truths held by the shadows who pulled the strings, or the forces that reduced a great palace to a whisper, those are the truths that are often the most defining.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.